What he took without touching me. Prologue after love becomes a wound. Clara Winters stood in the narrow hallway of her apartment, staring at the closed bedroom door as if it belonged to someone else's life. The light from the kitchen spilled across the hardwood floor in a pale yellow stripe, illuminating dust particles that drifted like tiny, aimless ghosts. It was 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and she was supposed to be at work. She had called in sick. That was 3 days ago. The apartment was quiet in a way that made her bones ache. Not the comfortable quiet of solitude, but the sharp-edged silence of absence. She had lived alone before. She was 38, after all, and had spent years cultivating a life that didn't require anyone else's permission or presence. But this quiet was different. This quiet had a shape. It pressed against her ribs when she breathed. The breakup had been unremarkable. There were no raised voices, no shattered dishes, no tearful ultimatums delivered in parking lots or airport terminals. There was no one else involved, no betrayal uncovered, no secret that came to light and changed everything. It had simply ended, the way a conversation ends when both people run out of things to say. Julian had sat across from her at the small dining table, the one they'd picked out together at an estate sale 2 years ago, and said the words that would later replay in her mind on an endless, merciless loop. "I care about you, Clara. You know that. But I don't think I loved you the way you loved me." The words had landed softly, almost gently, like snow. And just like snow, they had covered everything, cold and complete, until she couldn't see where solid ground ended and emptiness began. She hadn't argued. What was there to argue against? He hadn't said he didn't love her. He'd said he didn't love her. Enough. And that distinction felt important in a way she couldn't yet name. The worst part, the part that had kept her awake for 72 hours, pacing her apartment like a stranger in her own skin, was that Julian had been kind about it. He'd held her hand. He'd looked genuinely sorrowful. He'd packed his things slowly, methodically, asking her permission before taking the books they'd both read, the blanket his mother had given them, the coffee maker they'd split the cost of. He had been so careful not to hurt her. And that, somehow, was what destroyed her. Because if he had been cruel, if he had lied or cheated or disappeared without explanation, she would have had something to hold on to. Rage. Righteousness. The clean, sharp edges of injustice. But he had done none of those things. He had simply not loved her the way she needed. And there was no moral victory in that. No narrative where she could cast herself as the wronged party. She was not a victim of betrayal. She was a victim of arithmetic. The numbers hadn't added up. She had given more, felt more, hoped more. And he had known. God, he had known the whole time. And he had let her continue anyway, because it was easier than ending it. Easier than facing the fact that he was taking more than he could ever give back. Clara walked into the kitchen and filled a glass with water she didn't drink. She set it on the counter and stared at it. Her hands were shaking. They had been shaking for days, a fine, barely visible tremor that made simple tasks feel monumental. She had dropped a plate yesterday, shattered it on the tile floor and then stood there, staring at the pieces, unable to summon the energy to clean them up. They were still there, swept into a corner, a small pile of porcelain shards that caught the light. She thought about calling someone. Her sister, maybe, or her college roommate who still texted her on birthdays. But what would she say? He didn't love me enough. It sounded petty when she phrased it that way. It sounded like the complaint of someone who wanted too much, who was too needy, too fragile, too intense. And maybe she was all of those things. Maybe that was the problem. Julian had never asked her to be less. He had never told her to quiet down, to take up less space, to need him less. But she had done it anyway. She had learned, over the course of their 3-year relationship, to measure her words, to moderate her expectations, to swallow the small hurts and disappointments that accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river. She had learned to be grateful for what he did give, rather than resentful of what he didn't. And she had believed, truly believed, that this was what mature love looked like. That the early desperation, the all-consuming need to be seen and known and chosen above all others. That was the stuff of youth, of naivety. Real love, adult love, was quieter, more measured. It didn't demand. It didn't consume. It simply was. Except it hadn't been, had it? It had been something else entirely. A performance. A careful balancing act where she had convinced herself that asking for less made her stronger, more independent, more worthy of love. But all it had made her was invisible. Clara pressed her palms against the cool granite countertop and closed her eyes. She could still remember the exact moment she'd realized it. Not when Julian had said the words, but later after he'd left, when she was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their relationship like a film reel. She had remembered the time she'd wanted to talk about moving in together. How she'd brought it up casually, lightly, as if it were just an idea she'd been toying with and not something she'd been thinking about for months. And Julian had smiled, that easy, affectionate smile, and said, "Maybe someday. Let's not rush it." She had agreed. Of course she had agreed. Because rushing things was immature, wasn't it? And she was mature. She was patient. She could wait. Except, someday had never come. And when she'd brought it up again, 6 months later, he'd said the same thing. And she had let it go. Again. She remembered the birthday when he'd forgotten to plan anything, and she'd laughed it off, told him it wasn't a big deal, suggested they order takeout and watch a movie. She remembered the nights she'd wanted to talk, really talk, about fears and dreams and the shape of their future, and he'd been tired, or distracted, or just not in the mood. And she had told herself that was fine. That she was being unreasonable, expecting too much. She had spent 3 years making herself smaller, quieter, less demanding. And she had believed it was love. She had believed it was growth. But it wasn't growth. It was disappearance. And the cruelest part, the part that made her chest tighten until she couldn't breathe, was that Julian hadn't even noticed. He hadn't noticed her shrinking. Hadn't noticed the way she'd learned to anticipate his moods, to avoid certain topics, to accept less and less until she was practically living on crumbs. He hadn't noticed because he'd been comfortable. Because her silence had been convenient. Because a woman who doesn't ask for much is easy to love, or at least, easy to keep. Clara opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the darkened window above the sink. She looked tired. Hollow. Like someone had scooped out her insides and left only the shell. She thought about what Julian had said, right before he walked out the door. He'd paused, his hand on the doorknob, and turned back to look at her. "I hope you find someone who can love you the way you deserve." At the time, she'd thought it was kind. Now, in the cold, unforgiving light of hindsight, she understood what he'd really meant. "I hope you find someone who wants to." Because he hadn't. He had cared. He had been fond of her. He had enjoyed her company, her warmth, her willingness to make his life easier without asking for much in return. But he had never wanted her. Not in the bone-deep, consuming way she had wanted him. And that was the wound that wouldn't close. Not the loss of him, but the realization that she had never truly been chosen. That she had spent 3 years auditioning for a role that had already been cast, just not with her. Clara picked up the glass of water and finally took a sip. It was room temperature, tasteless. She set it back down and stared at the pale yellow light stretching across the floor. Somewhere in this city, Julian was moving on. He was probably relieved. Probably felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of her unspoken expectations. He would meet someone new, someone who asked for less, or maybe someone who asked for more, but in a way that felt exciting rather than exhausting. And he would love that person. Maybe not perfectly, but enough. And Clara would still be here, standing in her kitchen, trying to understand how love could be so quiet, so unremarkable, and still destroy her so completely. She turned away from the window and walked back into the hallway. The bedroom door was still closed. She had avoided going in there since Julian left, as if crossing that threshold would make his absence real in a way she wasn't ready to face. But she couldn't stay in the hallway forever. Clara reached for the doorknob, her hand still trembling, and turned it slowly. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing the familiar room bathed in late afternoon light. The bed was unmade. The closet door hung open, half empty now. Everything looked the same, but emptier, lighter, like a stage set after the actors had left. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then she whispered the thought that had been circling her mind for days, the one she had been too afraid to say out loud. I was never really here, was I? The words hung in the air, unanswered. And for the first time since Julian had walked out, Clara felt something other than pain. She felt rage. Not at him. At herself. Because he hadn't taken anything from her. She had given it all away. Piece by piece, word by word, desire by desire. She had dismantled herself in the name of love, and called it maturity. And now she was standing in an empty bedroom, holding the fragments of a person she barely recognized, trying to remember what it had felt like to want something, anything, without apology. Clara took a breath. Then another. The rage was still there, burning low and steady beneath her ribs. But so was something else. Something quieter but no less fierce. A question. If she had disappeared once, could she come back? And if she did, if she found her way back to the woman she had been before she learned to make herself small, would she still want love? Or would she have learned, finally, that wanting was the danger all along? She didn't know. But as she stood there in the doorway, staring at the ghost of a life she'd built with someone who had never truly seen her, Clara made herself a promise. She would never disappear again. Not for anyone. Not even for love. Chapter 1: The Illusion of Being Chosen. The first time Clara met Julian was at a gallery opening in the West Village. She had gone alone, which wasn't unusual for her. At 35, she had mastered the art of being comfortable in her own company, or at least convincing herself that she was. He'd been standing in front of a massive abstract piece, all sharp angles and bleeding reds, holding a glass of wine with the casual confidence of someone who belonged everywhere. When he caught her looking, he smiled. "What do you think it means?" he'd asked, gesturing at the canvas. Clara had studied it for a moment, tilting her head. "I think it means the artist had a deadline." He'd laughed, really laughed, not the polite chuckle people gave at gallery openings when they wanted to seem cultured. And that laugh had hooked something inside her chest, something she hadn't known was waiting to be caught. They'd talked for 2 hours. About art, about the city, about nothing and everything. He told her he was an architect, that he spent his days designing spaces for other people to live in but rarely thought about his own. She told him she worked in publishing, editing other people's stories while her own stayed locked in notebooks she never opened. When he asked for her number, she gave it without hesitation. And when he called 2 days later, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Chosen. Now, sitting on her couch with her laptop open to an untouched manuscript, Clara tried to remember when that feeling had started to fade. When had chosen become convenient? When had his attention shifted from intentional to incidental? She thought back to their early months together. The texts that came unprompted, full of observations about his day or questions about hers. The way he'd show up at her apartment with coffee on Saturday mornings, not because she'd asked, but because he'd been thinking about her. The nights they'd stayed up until 3 in the morning, tangled in each other and in conversations that felt like discovering new continents. It had felt effortless then. Natural. Like 2 rivers merging into one current. But somewhere along the way, she couldn't pinpoint exactly when, the current had slowed. His texts became responses rather than initiations. The Saturday mornings grew sporadic, then stopped altogether. The late-night conversations dwindled into comfortable silences that weren't quite as comfortable as she pretended they were. And Clara had told herself it was normal. That the intensity of new love always faded. That what they had now was better, more sustainable. Adult. She closed her laptop and picked up her phone, scrolling through old messages. There was a gap of 3 months where she'd initiated nearly every conversation. She hadn't noticed it at the time, or maybe she had and chose to ignore it. She remembered making excuses for him. He was busy with a big project at work, he wasn't good at texting, he showed his affection in other ways. Except she couldn't remember what those other ways were. Clara set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. The apartment was too quiet again. She'd thought about putting on music, but music required decision-making, and decision-making required energy she didn't have. She thought about their first anniversary. She'd spent weeks planning it, made a reservation at the restaurant where they'd had their first real date, bought him a first edition of a book he'd mentioned loving as a teenager. She'd been so excited, so certain that he'd appreciate the thoughtfulness, the attention to detail. He'd shown up 20 minutes late with a bottle of wine and an apology. No gift. No card. When she'd asked about it later, trying to keep her voice light, he'd looked genuinely confused. "I didn't know we were doing gifts," he'd said. "You didn't tell me." And she'd swallowed the disappointment, smiled, told him it was fine. Because saying it wasn't fine would have made her seem demanding. Ungrateful. The kind of woman who kept score. But wasn't that exactly what love was supposed to be? A careful accounting of give and take, where both people tried to tip the scales in the other's favor. Clara stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Below, the city moved in its endless rhythm, people rushing somewhere, always somewhere, with purpose she couldn't summon. She remembered the second year. The pattern had solidified by then. She would suggest plans, and he would agree or decline based on his schedule, his mood, his energy level. She learned to read him, to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. She learned that bringing up certain topics, their future, his emotional availability, the growing distance between them, would result in him shutting down, becoming distant in a way that terrified her. So she stopped bringing them up. She told herself she was being mature. That relationships required compromise. That love wasn't about grand gestures or constant validation. It was about showing up, day after day, even when it was hard. Except Julian wasn't showing up. Not really. He was there physically, sleeping in her bed 3 nights a week, eating dinners she cooked, watching movies she chose because he never seemed to care what they watched. But he wasn't present. Not in the way that mattered. And Clara had become an expert at not noticing. At filling the silence with her own voice, her own efforts, her own hope that if she just tried hard enough, if she just asked for little enough, he would eventually meet her halfway. But he never did. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. "How are you holding up?" Clara stared at the message. How was she holding up? She didn't know how to answer that. She was functioning, showering, eating, going through the motions, but functioning wasn't the same as living. She felt like a photograph of herself, two-dimensional and static, unable to step out of the frame. She typed back, "I'm okay. Just processing." It was a lie, but it was an easier lie than the truth. The truth was too complicated, too messy. The truth was that she was angry, not at Julian for leaving, but at herself for staying so long in something that had stopped nourishing her years ago. Clara thought about the 3rd year, the final year. By then, she had perfected the art of lowering her expectations. When he cancelled plans, she didn't get upset. When he forgot important dates, she reminded herself that dates were arbitrary. When he spent entire evenings on his phone while sitting next to her, she told herself it was comfortable, that they didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. But they weren't connected. They were coexisting. And she had known it. Deep down, in the part of herself she'd learned to silence, she had known it all along. She remembered a night about 6 months ago. They'd been lying in bed, the room dark except for the glow of the streetlight outside. She turned to him, wanting to ask him something. She couldn't even remember what now, and found him already asleep. She'd lain there, staring at his sleeping face, and felt a wave of loneliness so profound it had stolen her breath. She was lying next to someone she loved, in a bed they shared, in an apartment that held 3 years of their life together, and she had never felt more alone. That should have been her sign. That should have been the moment she asked herself the hard questions, the ones she'd been avoiding. But she hadn't. She'd rolled over, closed her eyes, and told herself she was being dramatic. That every long-term relationship had moments like this. That love wasn't supposed to be fireworks all the time. She'd been right about that last part. Love wasn't supposed to be fireworks all the time. But it also wasn't supposed to feel like drowning. Clara walked back to the couch and sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. She thought about all the times she'd made excuses for him. All the times she'd reframed his lack of effort as respect for her independence. All the times she'd convinced herself that not needing much from him made her strong. But it hadn't made her strong. It had made her invisible. She'd spent 3 years auditioning for a role she already had, performing a version of herself that was easy to love because she asked for so little. And Julian had accepted that performance without question, without ever digging beneath the surface to see what she was hiding. Or maybe he had seen it and simply didn't care. That thought hurt more than anything else. The possibility that he'd known she was giving more than she was getting, that she was bending herself into shapes that fit his life, and he'd let her do it because it was easier than having a conversation about what she actually needed. Clara's phone buzzed again. Another text from her sister. "Call me if you need to talk. I mean it." She set the phone face down on the coffee table. She didn't want to talk. Talking would require her to articulate feelings she didn't fully understand yet, to put words to a grief that felt too slippery, too complex to pin down. Because this wasn't just grief over losing Julian. It was grief over losing herself. Over realizing that the woman she'd become in that relationship, accommodating, undemanding, endlessly patient, wasn't who she actually was. It was who she thought she needed to be loved. And the worst part was that it hadn't even worked. Clara stood and walked to the kitchen, mechanically making a cup of tea she wouldn't drink. As she waited for the water to boil, she let herself remember one more thing. The last conversation before the breakup. She'd asked him, finally, what he wanted from their relationship. Where he saw it going. It was the first time in months she'd asked a direct question. The first time she'd allowed herself to be vulnerable instead of careful. He'd looked uncomfortable. Shifted in his seat. Said something vague about taking things as they came, about not needing to put labels or timelines on things. And she'd felt it then. The truth she'd been avoiding. He wasn't taking things as they came. He was keeping his options open. He was comfortable with what they had because it cost him nothing to maintain it, and everything to change it. She had been an option. A placeholder. A person-shaped space in his life that he'd filled because it was easy, not because it was essential. The kettle screamed. Clara turned off the stove and poured the water, watching the tea steep, the color bleeding through the clear liquid like a bruise. She had built a cage for herself out of patience and understanding and the desperate need to be enough. And she had locked herself inside it, convinced that this was what love looked like when you were mature enough to handle it. But love wasn't supposed to feel like captivity. Clara carried the tea to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, other people were living lives that felt full. Other women were loved by men who saw them, who chose them not because it was easy but because they couldn't imagine not choosing them. She wanted that. God, she wanted that with a ferocity that scared her. But she also knew, standing there in the failing light, that before she could have it, she needed to figure out who she was without the performance. Without the careful editing of her needs, her desires, her voice. She needed to remember what it felt like to want without apology. And that terrified her more than anything else. Chapter 2. The night he let her fall. It was a Tuesday when everything ended. Not a Friday, not a weekend when endings seemed more dramatic, more fitting. Just an ordinary Tuesday in March, with rain tapping against the windows and the smell of reheated pasta in the air. Clara had made dinner, nothing special, just spaghetti with marinara sauce and a salad she'd assembled while listening to a podcast about women who disappeared into marriages and forgot their own names. The irony wasn't lost on her, even then. Julian arrived at 7:30, 15 minutes later than he'd said he would. It wasn't unusual. She'd stopped commenting on it months ago, had learned that pointing out small disappointments only made her seem petty, made him defensive in a way that left her apologizing for bringing it up at all. They ate in relative silence. He mentioned a project at work, something about a client who couldn't make up their mind about materials. She told him about a manuscript she'd rejected that day, a thriller with a promising premise but a protagonist who made choices that felt more plot-driven than human. "Sounds frustrating," he said, not looking up from his plate. "It is," she agreed, though she wasn't sure if he was talking about her day or his. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Clara poured herself a glass of wine, offered him one. He declined. Said he had an early meeting tomorrow, needed to stay sharp. She should have known then. Should have read the signs in his posture, the way he sat on the edge of the couch rather than sinking into it, the way his eyes kept drifting to his phone even though he wasn't checking it. But she'd become so good at not noticing. "I've been thinking," Julian said finally, and something in his tone made her stomach drop. Not angry. Not heated. Just resolved. Clara set her wine glass down carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever was about to happen. About what? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw it in his eyes. The decision had already been made. This wasn't a conversation. It was an announcement. "About us," he said. "About where this is going." Her heart was pounding now, a sick, heavy rhythm that made her feel dizzy. "Okay." Julian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd always found endearing, but now it just looked like discomfort, like he wanted to be anywhere but here. "I care about you, Clara. You know I do." There it was. But that hung in the air like smoke. "But," she prompted, her voice steadier than she felt. He exhaled slowly. "But I don't think I'm in the right place for this. For what you need." Clara felt something crack inside her chest. "What I need?" "Julian, I've never asked you for anything." "I know," he said quietly. "That's part of the problem." She stared at him, confusion mixing with anger. "I don't understand. You're ending this because I don't ask for enough." "No." He shook his head, looking frustrated now. "I'm ending this because you deserve more than I can give. And I can't pretend anymore that what I'm giving is enough." "But I've never said it wasn't enough," Clara heard herself say, hating how desperate she sounded, hating that she was already trying to fix this, to make it okay, to convince him he was wrong. "That's exactly it," Julian said, and there was something like sadness in his eyes. "You never say it. You never ask for more. You never push back when I cancel plans, or when I'm distant, or when I'm clearly not showing up the way a partner should. You just accept it. And I think you accept it because you think that's all you can expect from me." Clara felt her face flush. "That's not fair." "Maybe not," he agreed. "But it's true, isn't it? You've made yourself so small in this relationship. So easy. And I let you do it because it was convenient for me. But that's not love, Clara. I don't know what it is, but it's not love." The words hit her like a physical blow. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but what could she say? He was right. She had made herself small. She had accepted less and called it maturity. "So what are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian looked down at his hands. "I'm saying I don't love you the way you love me. I don't think I ever did. And I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but I can't keep pretending that I do." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara could hear the rain against the windows, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of her own breathing. Everything felt too loud, too sharp, too real. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. He hesitated. "A while." "How long is a while? Does it matter?" "Yes," she said, her voice hardening. "It matters." "Was it months? A year?" Julian looked uncomfortable. "I don't know. Maybe since the beginning. Maybe I was never as all in as you were." Clara felt the air leave her lungs. Since the beginning. 3 years. 3 years of showing up, of trying, of loving him with everything she had. And he'd known. He'd known the whole time that he wasn't meeting her there, wasn't matching her intensity, wasn't choosing her the way she'd chosen him. Why? The word came out broken. Why did you stay if you knew? I thought it would change, he said quietly. I thought maybe I just needed time. That I'd catch up to where you were. And you made it so easy to stay. You never demanded anything. You never made me face what I was, or wasn't, feeling. Clara laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. So this is my fault. I made it too easy to use me. No, Julian said quickly. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not trying to blame you. I'm trying to be honest. For once. How noble, she said, and she could hear the acid in her own voice. He flinched. I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I need you to understand. I never wanted to hurt you. I care about you. I can't give you what you need. And what is it you think I need? Clara asked. Since apparently you've spent 3 years cataloging all the ways you're failing me. Julian looked at her steadily. You need someone who sees you. Who wants to see you. Someone who doesn't let you disappear because it's easier than dealing with what you actually feel. The truth of it hit her like a wave. He was right. She had disappeared. She'd spent 3 years becoming a ghost of herself, and he'd been perfectly content to let her haunt his life without ever demanding she become solid again. I'm sorry, Julian said again, and he sounded like he meant it. I know that doesn't help. But I am. Clara stood, her legs shaky but determined. You should go. He nodded, standing as well. Do you want me to? Should I get my things now or? Now, she said firmly. Please. She watched as he moved through her apartment, gathering his belongings. A toothbrush from the bathroom. A few shirts from the closet. A book from the nightstand. It took him less than 15 minutes to erase 3 years of his presence from her life. At the door, he paused. I hope you find what you're looking for, Clara. I really do. She didn't respond. Couldn't. If she opened her mouth, everything would come pouring out. The rage, the grief, the humiliation of realizing she'd been auditioning for a part she'd never get. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Clara stood in the sudden silence of her apartment, feeling the weight of his absence settle over her like snow. She walked to the couch and sat down, her body moving on autopilot. Her wineglass was still on the coffee table, half full. She picked it up, stared at it, then set it back down. The worst part, the part that made her chest feel like it was caving in, was that she couldn't even hate him. He'd done the one thing she'd never expected. He'd been honest. Brutally, painfully honest. And in his honesty, he'd held up a mirror to everything she'd been avoiding about herself. She had made herself small. She had accepted less than she deserved. She had loved someone who couldn't, or wouldn't, love her back, and she'd called it compromise. Clara pulled her knees to her chest and let the first sob break free. It came from somewhere deep, somewhere she'd been keeping locked away for years. And once it started, she couldn't stop it. She cried for the relationship she'd lost. For the 3 years she'd spent trying to be enough. For the woman she'd been before Julian, the one who'd known how to take up space without apology. But mostly, she cried because somewhere in the midst of all that pain, there was a tiny, terrible spark of relief. Relief that she didn't have to pretend anymore. That she didn't have to keep making herself smaller to fit into a space that was never meant for her. Relief that it was over. Even if she didn't know yet who she was without him. Even if the thought of rebuilding herself from scratch felt impossible. Even if the grief was so heavy she could barely breathe under its weight. It was over. And somehow that mattered. Clara stayed on the couch until the rain stopped and the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn. She didn't sleep. Didn't move. Just sat there, letting the reality of her new life settle into her bones. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across her apartment, she stood. Her body ached from sitting in one position for so long. Her eyes were swollen, her throat raw. But she was still here. Still breathing. Still whole, even if she felt shattered. And maybe, Just maybe that was enough to start with. Chapter 3: No villain, only damage. The hardest part about heartbreak, Clara discovered, was the absence of villainy. A week after Julian left, she found herself scrolling through articles about toxic relationships, emotional abuse, gaslighting. She read stories of women who'd been manipulated, deceived, systematically torn down by partners who enjoyed the power imbalance. But none of it fit. Julian hadn't manipulated her. He'd never lied, never cheated, never raised his voice or his hand. He'd been kind, thoughtful even in his own limited way. He'd brought her soup when she was sick. He'd listened when she talked about work, even if his eyes sometimes glazed over. He'd said thank you when she cooked, good morning when he woke up beside her, goodbye when he left. He'd done all the things a decent person does. And somehow, it hadn't been enough. Or rather, and this was the thought that kept her awake at night, she hadn't been enough. Clara sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open to a blank document, supposedly working on edits for a romance manuscript about second chances. The irony was suffocating. She was supposed to be helping shape a story about love conquering all, about people fighting for each other, choosing each other against the odds. But she couldn't focus. Her mind kept circling back to the same question. If Julian wasn't a villain, what did that make her? A victim implied someone had wronged you. But Julian had been honest. Brutally so. He'd told her the truth she'd been avoiding for 3 years, that he didn't love her the way she loved him. That he'd never pretended to. She was the one who'd pretended. She was the one who'd convinced herself that his lukewarm affection was enough, that his occasional attention was a treasure rather than a scrap. Her phone buzzed. A text from her best friend Mira. "How are you doing? Want to grab lunch?" Clara stared at the message. She'd been avoiding Mira since the breakup. Avoiding everyone, really. Because how do you explain to people that you're devastated over losing something you never really had? She typed back, "I'm okay. Rain check." The response came immediately. "You've been saying that for a week. I'm coming over." Clara closed her eyes. She didn't want company. Didn't want to perform wellness or pretend she was handling this better than she was. But Mira wouldn't take no for an answer. She never did. 40 minutes later, there was a knock at her door. Clara opened it to find Mira holding 2 coffees and a bag of pastries, her expression a careful mixture of concern and determination. "You look terrible," Mira said, pushing past her into the apartment. "Thanks," Clara said dryly, closing the door. Mira set the coffees on the counter and turned to face her. "I mean it. You look like you haven't slept in days." "I haven't." "Clara." Myra's voice softened. "Talk to me. What's going on in that head of yours?" Clara sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted. "I don't know how to explain it." "Try." Clara picked at a thread on her sleeve. "I keep waiting to be angry at him. To hate him. But I can't. He didn't do anything wrong. Not really." "He broke your heart," Mira said flatly. "That's something. But he didn't break it maliciously. He was honest. He told me he didn't love me enough. And I can't hate someone for telling the truth, can I?" Mira pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Clara, you can be hurt by someone's honesty. You can be devastated by it. That doesn't make it your fault. Doesn't it?" Clara looked up. "I'm the one who stayed for 3 years knowing something was off. I'm the one who kept making excuses, who kept accepting less. I'm the one who convinced myself that being low maintenance made me strong instead of invisible." "You loved him," Mira said gently. "That's not a crime. But he didn't love me. Not really. And he knew it. The whole time, Mira, he knew it. And he stayed anyway because I made it easy for him." Mira was quiet for a moment. "Did he tell you that?" "More or less. He said I never asked for anything. That I made myself small. That he let me do it because it was convenient." Clara's voice cracked. "And the worst part is, he's right. I did make myself small. I thought that's what love was, making space for someone else by taking up less yourself. That's not love, Mira said firmly. That's erasure. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I don't know how I got here. I used to be. I used to know what I wanted. I used to ask for things without apologizing. When did I stop? Probably when you met someone who made you feel like wanting things was too much. Clara shook her head. But he never said that. He never told me I was too much. He didn't have to. Some people communicate limits without words. They pull back when you get too close. They go quiet when you need too much. They make you feel like your needs are an inconvenience just by how they respond, or don't respond, to them. Clara thought about that. About all the time she'd started to express a need. For more time together, for deeper conversations, for some sign that she mattered to him as much as he mattered to her, and stopped herself. Not because he'd said anything, but because of the way his body language changed. The slight tension in his shoulders. The way his eyes would drift away. The careful neutrality in his tone that somehow felt like rejection. I trained myself, she said quietly. I trained myself to want less so he wouldn't have to give more. And that's not your fault, Mira said. That's what happens when someone doesn't meet you halfway. You convince yourself the middle is closer to their side than yours. Clara wiped her eyes. But I can't even be angry at him. That's what's killing me. If he'd cheated, if he'd lied, if he'd been cruel, I could be angry. I could hate him. But he was just himself. And himself wasn't enough. And somehow that feels worse than if he'd been a monster. Mira reached across the table and took her hand. You know what I think. I think you're grieving two things. The relationship you lost, and the version of yourself you gave up to keep it. The truth of it hit Clara like a punch. That was exactly it. She wasn't just mourning Julian. She was mourning the woman she'd been before him, the one who took up space without apology, who asked for what she wanted, who didn't apologize for having needs. I don't know how to get her back, Clara whispered. Maybe you don't get her back, Mira said. Maybe you become someone new. Someone who's been through this and survived it. Someone who knows what it costs to make yourself small and refuses to pay that price again. Clara looked at her friend, this woman who'd known her for 15 years, who'd seen her through breakups and job losses and the death of her father. Mira had always been steady, solid. The kind of person who said what she meant and meant what she said. How do you do it? Clara asked. How do you just exist without apologizing for it? Mira smiled sadly. Practice. And a lot of failed relationships where I learned what happens when you don't. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee, the morning light streaming through the windows. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, not relief exactly, but something close to it. Permission, maybe. Permission to be hurt without needing to assign blame. Permission to grieve what she'd lost, including the parts of herself she'd given away. I keep thinking about what he said, Clara said finally. About how I need someone who sees me. Who wants to see me. What about it? What if I don't even know who I am anymore? How can someone see me if I've spent 3 years hiding? Mira set down her coffee cup. Then maybe that's where you start. Not with finding someone who sees you, but with letting yourself be seen. By yourself, first. Figure out who you are when you're not performing for someone else's comfort. Clara nodded slowly. It sounded simple when Mira said it. But she knew it wouldn't be. Unlearning 3 years of self-erasure, of careful editing, of swallowing wants and needs. That was going to be harder than anything she'd done before. What if I'm too damaged? She asked quietly. What if I've been broken by this and I can't be put back together? Damage isn't the same as destroyed, Mira said. You're hurt. You're grieving. But you're not broken, Clara. You're just cracked open. And maybe that's what you needed to be to finally let the light in. Clara wanted to believe that. wanted to believe that this pain had purpose, that there was something on the other side of it worth reaching for. But right now, all she could feel was the ache. The absence. The gaping wound where Julian had been, and where she'd been before she started disappearing. Mira stayed for another hour, talking about nothing important. Work gossip, a show she'd been watching, plans for her sister's birthday. Normal things. Human things. Things that reminded Clara that life continued even when you felt like yours had stopped. When Mira finally left, Clara stood at the window and watched her walk down the street, phone already pressed to her ear, probably calling someone else who needed her steadiness. Clara turned back to her empty apartment. It felt different now. Still quiet, still lonely, but somehow less suffocating. As if Myra's presence had opened a window and let in fresh air. She picked up her laptop and looked at the blank document still open on her screen. The romance manuscript she was supposed to be editing. She read the first paragraph again, about a woman who'd given up on love and a man who was determined to change her mind. Clara used to believe in stories like that. Used to think that love was about someone pursuing you, convincing you, fighting for you. But now she wondered if maybe the real love story was the one where you fought for yourself first. Where you decided you were worth pursuing, worth choosing, worth showing up for. She closed the laptop and walked to the bedroom. In the mirror above her dresser, she caught sight of herself. Hair unbrushed, face pale, eyes red-rimmed from crying. She looked like someone who'd been through a war. And maybe that's exactly what this was. A war between the woman she'd become and the woman she used to be. Between the part of her that wanted to disappear and the part that was tired of being invisible. Clara didn't know who would win that war. Didn't know if there would be a winner at all, or just a different version of herself emerging from the wreckage. But as she stood there, meeting her own eyes in the mirror, she made herself a promise. She wouldn't disappear again. Even if being visible hurt. Even if taking up space felt terrifying. Even if asking for what she wanted meant risking rejection. She would show up. For herself, at least. And maybe, eventually, that would be enough. Chapter 4: The Woman Who Learned to Disappear. 3 weeks after the breakup, Clara went back to work. She told her boss she'd had the flu, which wasn't entirely a lie. Heartbreak felt like illness. The same exhaustion, the same inability to focus, the same sense that her body wasn't quite her own anymore. Her colleagues were kind in that careful, don't ask too many questions way. They welcomed her back with sympathetic smiles and offers of coffee, but no one pushed for details. Clara was grateful. She didn't have the energy to perform normalcy while also explaining why she'd fallen apart. But being back at work meant being alone with her thoughts in a different way. At home, she could wallow. At work, she had to function. Had to sit through meetings and respond to emails and pretend that words on a page still mattered to her. The manuscript on her desk was a contemporary romance about a baker who falls for the food critic determined to shut down her shop. It was charming. Well written. The kind of book that would sell well and make readers swoon. Clara hated it. Not because it was bad, but because it was built on a lie she'd spent 3 years believing. That love could grow from conflict, that passion was born from friction, that two people could start as adversaries and end as soulmates through sheer force of narrative will. Real life didn't work that way. Real life was two people slowly drifting apart until one of them finally acknowledged the distance. Real life was quiet disappointments and unspoken resentments. Real life was waking up one day and realizing you'd been alone even when someone was sleeping beside you. Clara opened the manuscript and tried to read. The baker, Sophie, was defending her grandmother's recipes to the critic, Marcus, who was insisting that tradition without innovation was stagnation. It was supposed to be their meet-cute, the spark that would eventually ignite into passion. But all Clara could think was, what happens after the spark fades? What happens when Marcus stops finding Sophie's stubbornness charming and starts finding it exhausting? When Sophie realizes that Marcus's criticism isn't constructive, it's just criticism. When they've run out of witty banter and are left with the mundane reality of coexistence. Clara closed the manuscript and rubbed her eyes. She couldn't do this. Couldn't sit here editing fairy tales when her own story had ended with such brutal honesty. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hi Clara, it's Julian. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing. I hope that's okay." Clara stared at the message, her heart rate spiking. Part of her wanted to respond immediately, to tell him she was fine, that she'd moved on, that his absence had barely registered in her life. Another part wanted to tell him the truth, that she was drowning, that every day felt like swimming through concrete, that she woke up every morning and for one blissful second forgot he was gone before reality crashed back in. Instead, she locked her phone and set it face down on her desk. She wouldn't respond. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because what could she possibly say? What conversation could they have that wouldn't just reopen wounds that were barely beginning to scab over? Clara stood and walked to the break room, needing to move, to do something other than sit with the weight of that unanswered message. The office was quiet. Most people were in the afternoon meeting she'd managed to avoid by claiming she needed to catch up on work. She poured herself coffee she didn't want and stood by the window, looking out at the city. Somewhere down there, people were living their lives. Falling in love. Falling out of it. Making mistakes. Learning from them. Moving forward in whatever messy, imperfect way humans moved forward. And Clara was stuck. Trapped in the space between who she'd been with Julian and who she might become without him. She thought about what Mira had said. About becoming someone new. Someone who'd survived this and learned from it. But how do you become someone new when you don't even know who the old you was anymore? Clara had spent so long editing herself, trimming away the parts that might be too much, too needy, too intense, that she'd lost track of what was editing and what was actually her. She'd become a curated version of herself, carefully constructed to be easy to love. Or at least, easy to keep. And it hadn't worked. She took a sip of coffee and nearly gagged. It was burnt. Bitter. She dumped it in the sink and leaned against the counter, closing her eyes. The worst part, the part she hadn't admitted even to Mira, was that she'd known. Not consciously, maybe. But on some level, she'd known that Julian wasn't all in. She'd felt it in the way he held her. With affection, yes, but not with desperation. Not with the kind of grip that said I need you, I choose you, I can't imagine my life without you. He'd held her the way you hold something pleasant but replaceable. And she'd let him. Because being held with lukewarm affection felt better than not being held at all. Clara opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the break room window. She looked tired. Hollow. Like a sketch of herself rather than the finished painting. She remembered the woman she'd been at 25, fresh out of graduate school, full of opinions and ambitions and an almost reckless certainty about what she wanted from life. That woman had taken up space. Had laughed too loud, talked too much, wanted things without apology. That woman had been exhausting. Clara knew that. She'd been intense, demanding, quick to anger and quick to forgive. She'd been a lot. But she'd also been alive. When had she decided that being alive was too much? When had she started equating taking up space with being a burden? Clara thought back to her relationship before Julian. David. They'd dated for 2 years in her early 30s. He'd been the first person to make her feel like her intensity was a problem. Not explicitly, he'd never said the words. But there had been moments. Comments about how she was so passionate, said in a tone that didn't sound like a compliment. Suggestions that she relax, take it easy, not overthink things. She'd learned with David that passion made people uncomfortable. That expressing needs too clearly was aggressive. That wanting things, really wanting them, was unseemly. So she'd started to soften herself. To modulate her voice, her desires, her presence. To become more palatable. By the time she met Julian, she'd perfected the art of it. She'd become a woman who asked for little, expected less, and convinced herself that this restraint was a form of strength. But it wasn't strength. It was self-erasure. Clara walked back to her desk and sat down, staring at the manuscript. Sophie and Marcus. The baker and the critic. 2 people who would fight and banter their way into love, their rough edges somehow fitting together perfectly by page 300. She picked up her red pen, the one she used for edits, and started reading. But instead of marking grammar errors or pacing issues, she found herself writing notes in the margins. What happens after? Does Marcus still find her stubbornness charming in 5 years? Does Sophie ever resent having to defend herself constantly? She was ruining the manuscript with her cynicism, she knew. This wasn't what her job was. She was supposed to make the love story work, not question its foundation. But she couldn't stop. Because these were the questions no one had asked about her and Julian. Or if they had asked, she'd given them the easy answer: we're fine. We're solid. We're taking things slow but steady. She'd believed it. Or convinced herself she did. Because admitting that something was wrong would have meant doing something about it. And doing something about it would have meant risking the relationship ending. So she'd stayed silent. She'd made herself smaller. She'd performed contentment while suffocating on unspoken needs. Clara set down her pen and closed the manuscript. She couldn't do this. Couldn't sit here editing love stories when she was still trying to understand how her own had gone so wrong. Her phone was still face down on her desk, Julian's message waiting for a response she didn't know how to give. She picked it up, read it again. I wanted to check in, see how you're doing. The thing was, she didn't know how she was doing. Some days she felt like she was healing. Other days she felt like the wound was fresh and bleeding. Some moments she was angry. At him, at herself, at the whole stupid situation. Other moments she just felt tired. But she knew one thing. She couldn't go back. Couldn't slip into the easy comfort of reconciliation, of pretending that nothing had changed, of resuming the relationship with some vague promise that it would be different this time. Because it wouldn't be different. Not unless she was different. And she wasn't there yet. Clara typed out a response. I appreciate you checking in. I'm okay. I need some space right now, but I hope you're doing well. She stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. It was polite. Distant. The kind of thing you said to an ex when you wanted to close a door without slamming it. His response came almost immediately. I understand. Take care of yourself. And that was it. The conversation that could have spiraled into hours of dissection and analysis, and what-ifs ended with 2 brief, courteous messages. Clara set her phone down and took a breath. It felt like progress. Small, barely perceptible progress. But progress nonetheless. She looked at the manuscript again. Sophie and Marcus. The baker and the critic. 2 people who would fight their way into love. Maybe that was the fantasy. Not that love conquered all, but that it could be built on conflict and passion and dramatic declarations. That you could start as adversaries and end as soulmates through sheer force of will. Real love, the kind that lasted, wasn't built on passion alone. It was built on showing up. On seeing each other fully and choosing each other anyway. On creating space for both people to exist without one having to disappear for the other to be comfortable. Clara had disappeared. Slowly, incrementally, over 3 years. And Julian had let her. Not maliciously. Not even consciously, perhaps. But he'd let her nonetheless. And that was the lesson she needed to learn. Not how to avoid men like Julian. But how to avoid disappearing. How to stay solid, stay visible, stay present. Even when it was easier to fade into the background. Clara picked up her pen again and opened the manuscript. This time, she read it as an editor, not as a woman nursing a broken heart. She marked typos, noted pacing issues, suggested places where the dialogue could be sharper. And when she got to a scene where Sophie compromised her values to keep Marcus happy, Clara wrote in the margin, "This feels out of character." Sophie wouldn't give up this easily. Show her fighting for what matters to her. It was a small note. A tiny editorial suggestion that probably wouldn't make it into the final draft. But as Clara wrote it, she felt something shift inside her. A small recognition. A quiet acknowledgement. She hadn't fought for what mattered to her. She'd given up. Easily. Quietly. without protest. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real work ahead of her. Not finding someone who would love her the right way, but learning to fight for herself. To refuse to disappear, even when disappearing was easier. Clara closed the manuscript and looked at the clock. 4:30. Another hour before she could leave. She opened her email and started typing. Not to Julian. Not to anyone expecting a response. But to herself. Things I need to remember. 1. Taking up space is not the same as being a burden. 2. Asking for what you need is not demanding. 3. Love should not require you to disappear. She saved the email as a draft and closed her laptop. It was a start. Small, imperfect, but a start nonetheless. And maybe that was all anyone could do. Start. Keep starting. Until one day, you looked up and realized you'd built something solid out of all those small beginnings. Clara gathered her things and headed for the elevator. As she waited for it to arrive, she caught her reflection in the polished metal doors. She still looked tired. Still looked like someone recovering from an illness. But there was something else there too. Something she hadn't seen in a long time. Determination. Small. Tentative. But there. And for now that was enough. Chapter 5. A Man Who Sees the Hunger. Clara met Evan on a rainy Saturday in October, 6 months after Julian. She wasn't looking. Wasn't even open to the possibility. She'd spent the last half year learning to be alone, not just physically, but emotionally. Learning to sit with her own thoughts without the constant need to moderate them for someone else's comfort. The coffee shop was crowded, every table taken. Clara had claimed a corner spot by the window with her laptop and a manuscript she was supposed to finish editing by Monday. She'd been there for 2 hours, successfully avoiding eye contact with anyone who might need her table. Mind if I sit? She looked up to find a man holding a coffee cup, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes that were more gray than blue. There was something direct about the way he looked at her, not aggressive, but not apologetic either. Actually, Clara started, ready with her practiced excuse about expecting someone. You're not, he said, not unkindly. You've been alone for 2 hours. And every other seat is taken. So unless you're planning to buy another coffee to justify the real estate, I'm asking to share the table. Clara blinked. Most people would have just walked away when she started to decline. But this man, whoever he was, had called her on her bullshit without even a hint of malice. Fine, she said, moving her bag to make room. Thanks. He sat down, pulled out his own laptop, and didn't say another word. Clara tried to focus on her manuscript, a thriller about a woman who fakes her own death to escape an abusive marriage. But she kept glancing across the table at the stranger. He typed quickly, efficiently, pausing occasionally to take a sip of coffee or to look out the window with an expression that suggested he was working through a problem in his head. After 30 minutes of silence, he looked up and caught her staring. Question, he asked. What? You keep looking at me. So I'm assuming you have a question. Clara felt her face heat. I wasn't. You were, he said. It's fine. I'm curious too. About what? What you're working on that's making you frown like that. Clara glanced at her screen. Manuscript. I'm an editor. And it's bad. No, it's good. The writing is good. But the protagonist keeps making choices that feel. She trailed off, not sure why she was explaining this to a stranger. Convenient, he offered. Exactly. She's supposed to be this fierce, independent woman, but she keeps deferring to what other people want. And the author keeps framing it as selflessness, but it just reads as disappearing. The man nodded slowly. Sounds personal. Clara's defenses went up immediately. Excuse me. The way you're talking about it. It sounds like it's hitting something personal. He said it matter-of-factly, without the tone people usually used when they thought they'd stumbled onto something sensitive. I don't know you, Clara said, her voice cooler than she intended. True. He took a sip of his coffee. But you brought up disappearing. That's not usually a word people use unless they know what it feels like. Clara stared at him. Most people would have backpedaled by now, apologized for overstepping. But he just looked at her, waiting. Not pushing, but not retreating either. Who are you? She asked finally. Evan. I'm a therapist. Of course you are, Clara muttered. He smiled, just slightly, at the corner of his mouth. And you're someone who's been told she's too much her whole life, so you learn to be less. How am I doing? Clara felt something inside her chest crack open. Not painfully, but startlingly. Like a window she'd forgotten could be opened. That's presumptuous, she managed. Maybe. But I'm not wrong. She wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him he didn't know her, couldn't possibly understand her from a 30-minute silence in a coffee shop. But the truth was, he'd seen something. Something she'd spent months trying to hide even from herself. I should go, Clara said, closing her laptop. You don't have to, Evan said. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. I see people. It's what I do. And I saw you. That's all. Clara paused, her laptop half-packed. You don't know anything about me. I know you're angry, he said. Not at me. At yourself. For letting someone convince you that taking up space was a problem. And I know you're trying to figure out how to be big again without feeling like you're doing something wrong. Clara's hands were shaking. Stop. Okay. He leaned back in his chair, putting distance between them. I'm sorry. Occupational hazard. I push too hard sometimes. Sometimes. Clara's voice was sharp, but beneath the sharpness was something else. Something that felt dangerously close to relief. Because he'd seen her. Really seen her. And he hadn't looked away. Evan pulled a business card from his wallet and slid it across the table. In case you ever want to talk. As a therapist or just someone who gets it. Clara looked at the card. Simple white, black text. Evan Pierce, LMFT. A phone number. She didn't pick it up. I don't need therapy. I didn't say you did, Evan said. But you need something. And whatever it is, you're not going to find it by hiding in coffee shops editing other people's stories. The accuracy of that statement made Clara's chest tighten. You don't know what I need. No, he agreed. But I think you do. You're just scared to ask for it. Clara stood, shoving her laptop into her bag with more force than necessary. Thanks for the psychoanalysis. Very helpful. You're welcome, Evan said, and there wasn't a trace of sarcasm in his voice. Just steady certainty. Like he'd said exactly what he meant to say and had no regrets about it. Clara walked out of the coffee shop into the rain, her heart pounding. She made it 3 blocks before she stopped, leaning against a building to catch her breath. Her bag was open. The business card was inside, tucked into the front pocket of her laptop case. She hadn't picked it up. She was sure she hadn't. But there it was. Evan Pierce, LMFT. Clara stared at it for a long time before shoving it deeper into her bag and continuing home through the rain. She wouldn't call him. She didn't need to. She was fine. She was handling this. But that night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, Clara thought about what Evan had said. He'd seen her. Not the curated version, not the careful edit. He'd seen the anger, the grief, the fear. And he hadn't flinched. It was terrifying. And also, in a way she didn't want to examine too closely, it was exhilarating. Because for 6 months, Clara had been invisible even to herself. She'd been so busy rebuilding, so focused on becoming someone who wouldn't disappear again, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. And Evan, this stranger in a coffee shop, had looked at her for 30 minutes and read her like a manuscript. It should have felt invasive. It should have felt like a violation. Instead, it felt like coming up for air after being underwater for too long. Clara rolled over and closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. She kept thinking about the way Evan had looked at her. Not with pity. Not with the careful concern people usually showed when they sensed damage. He'd looked at her with recognition. Like he'd seen her particular brand of brokenness before and wasn't impressed by it. Wasn't put off by it. Just saw it for what it was. It was the kind of seeing that didn't ask you to be smaller. It demanded you be bigger. And that, Clara realized, was what scared her most of all. Because she'd spent 6 months learning to be alone. Learning to take up space in her own life. Learning to want things without apology. But she hadn't tested any of it yet. Hadn't put herself in a situation where someone could see all of her, the messy, complicated, still healing parts, and choose her anyway. Or choose not to. Clara reached for her phone on the nightstand and pulled up her contacts. She found Evan's business card in her bag and typed in the number. She didn't call. Didn't even draft a text. Just saved the contact and set her phone back down. It felt like progress. Tiny, almost imperceptible progress. But it was something. And maybe, eventually, it would be enough. Chapter 6 Desire Feels Like Danger. Clara called Evan 3 weeks later. She told herself she was calling as a potential client, someone seeking professional help to process the end of her relationship. But when he answered, she found herself saying, "This is Clara. From the coffee shop." "I remember," Evan said. No surprise in his voice. Like he'd been expecting her call. "I'm not sure why I'm calling," Clara admitted. "Yes, you are," Evan said. "But you're scared to say it out loud." Clara laughed. A short, bitter sound. "Do you always talk to people like this?" "Like what?" "Like you can see through them." "Only when it's true," Evan said. "Do you want to meet?" "For therapy. If that's what you need to call it." Clara hesitated. There was something about the way he said it, not dismissive, but not entirely professional either. Like he was offering her something that existed in the space between therapy and connection. "Same coffee shop," she said finally. "Tomorrow. Noon." "See you then," Evan said, and hung up before she could change her mind. The next day, Clara arrived 10 minutes early. She ordered a coffee she didn't drink and sat at the same table by the window, watching people pass on the street. The rain had cleared, leaving the city washed clean and bright. Evan arrived exactly at noon. He got his coffee, sat down across from her, and waited. "So," Clara said finally, "how does this work?" "How does what work?" "This. Whatever this is. Are you my therapist now?" I don't know. What are we doing?" Evan leaned back in his chair. "What do you want to be doing?" Clara felt frustration bubble up. "Can you just answer a question directly?" "I am answering directly. You're asking me to define something that you need to define for yourself." "That's therapy speak." "Maybe. But it's also true." Evan looked at her steadily. "You called me, Clara. You came here. So clearly you want something. The question is whether you're brave enough to ask for it." Clara felt her face flush. "You're very annoying. I've been told that. Do you do this with all your clients? Needle them until they snap?" "You're not my client," Evan said. The words hung in the air between them. Clara's heart rate picked up. "What am I then?" "I don't know yet," Evan said. "But I know you're someone who spent too long making yourself small. And I know that when I look at you, I see someone who's starving. Not for food. For recognition. For being seen without having to hide." Clara's throat tightened. "You don't know me." "I'm starting to," Evan said. "And what I see scares you because you're not sure if you can trust it. If I'm seeing the real you or just the version you're trying to become." "Which one am I trying to become?" Clara asked quietly. "The one who doesn't apologize for existing," Evan said. "The one who asks for what she wants. The one who doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable." Clara looked down at her untouched coffee. What if I don't know how to be that person? Then you learn. Is that what you do? Teach people to be themselves. Sometimes. But mostly I just hold up a mirror and let them see what's already there. Clara met his eyes. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at her, like he was reading a book written in a language only he could understand. And what do you see when you look at me? Evan didn't answer right away. He studied her, and Clara felt exposed under his gaze. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but raw. Like he was looking past all the careful walls she'd built and seeing the mess underneath. I see someone who's angry, he said finally. Not at the man who left. At herself for staying. I see someone who's rebuilding but doesn't trust that what she's building will hold. And I see someone who wants to be wanted, really wanted, but is terrified of what that might cost. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back. You got all that from 30 minutes in a coffee shop? And this conversation, Evan added. You're very readable when you stop trying to hide. Maybe I should try harder to hide, Clara said, but there was no heat in it. You could, Evan agreed. But then you'd just be doing what you've always done. Making yourself small to be safe. What's wrong with being safe? Nothing. Unless safety is just another word for invisible. Clara took a sip of her coffee. It was cold now, bitter. She set it down and looked out the window. I don't know how to do this. Do what? Be seen. Be big. Be me. Without apologizing for it. Then that's where we start, Evan said. Is this therapy? Clara asked again. No, Evan said. This is something else. What? I don't know yet. But I'm willing to find out if you are. Clara looked at him. Really looked at him. There was no pity in his expression. No careful concern. Just steady attention. The kind that didn't look away when things got complicated. It was terrifying. It was also exactly what she needed. Okay, Clara said. Okay. Let's find out. Evan smiled. Small, barely there, but real. Good. They talked for another hour. Not about Julian, not about her past relationships. About smaller things. Books they'd read. Places they'd traveled. The ways they saw the world differently. And through it all, Clara felt something shift. A small unclenching in her chest. A tentative permission to take up space without immediately apologizing for it. When they finally stood to leave, Evan paused at the door. One rule, he said. What? No disappearing. If something bothers you, you say it. If you need something, you ask for it. No making yourself small to keep this comfortable. Clara felt a spike of anxiety. What if I can't? Then you practice until you can, Evan said. But I won't let you hide. That's the deal. Clara took a breath. It felt like standing on the edge of something. A cliff she could either step back from or jump off of. Okay, she said. Deal. Evan held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. See you next week? Yeah, Clara said. Next week. She watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the crowded street. And for the first time in months, Clara felt something other than grief or anger or fear. She felt anticipation. It wasn't comfortable. Wasn't safe. But it was alive. Electric. The feeling of standing at the beginning of something that could either destroy her or remake her. And Clara realized, standing there on the sidewalk with the autumn sun warming her face, that she was willing to find out which one it would be. Because whatever Evan was offering, therapy, friendship, something else entirely, it demanded she show up fully. No hiding. No disappearing. No making herself palatable. Just showing up as she was. Messy, complicated, still healing, and seeing if that was enough. For the first time in a long time, Clara thought it might be. Chapter 7 Choosing the Fire. 2 months into whatever this was with Evan, Clara found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. They'd been meeting twice a week, sometimes at the coffee shop, sometimes walking through the city, once at a small Italian restaurant where they'd argued about whether authenticity mattered more than innovation. Evan had taken the side of innovation. Clara had defended authenticity. Neither had budged, and both had enjoyed the friction. It wasn't dating. Not exactly. Evan never touched her beyond an occasional hand on her arm when making a point. Never suggested anything beyond their structured meetings. Never crossed the line from whatever this was into something clearly romantic. But it also wasn't friendship. There was too much intensity, too much weight to their conversations. Too much of Clara wanting to know everything about him while simultaneously wanting to keep him at a distance that felt manageable. "I don't know what we're doing," Clara finally said one evening as they walked along the waterfront, the city lights reflecting on the dark water. "Does it need a name?" Evan asked. "Yes," Clara said. "I need to know what this is so I know what I'm allowed to want from it." Evan stopped walking and turned to face her. "What do you want from it?" Clara felt her chest tighten. This was the moment. The one she'd been avoiding for 2 months. The moment where she had to be honest instead of careful. "I don't know," she said, which was a lie. "Yes, you do," Evan said. "You just don't want to say it. Because saying it makes it real." "It's already real, Clara. Saying it out loud doesn't change that." Clara looked out at the water, watching the lights dance on the surface. "What if I want something you can't give?" "Then I'll tell you. But you have to ask first." Clara turned to face him. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "I want more than this." "More than what?" "More than coffee shops and philosophical debates. More than you seeing me and never touching me. More than this. This careful distance where we're both pretending this is just friendship." Evan's expression didn't change. "And what does more look like?" Clara felt frustration bubble up. Can you meet me halfway on this? I'm putting myself out here and you're still asking questions." "I'm asking because I need to know if you want more because you actually want me, or because you want to prove to yourself that you can be wanted." The words hit like a slap. Clara stepped back. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" Evan's voice was gentle but unyielding. "You spent 3 years with someone who didn't choose you." "Not really. And now you're here with me and I see you, really see you, and you want to know if that seeing translates into wanting. But I need you to separate those things. Because I won't be your proof of concept." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You think that's what you are to me?" "I think you're still figuring it out," Evan said. "And I think you need to figure it out before we move this into something neither of us can walk back from." "So what? We just keep doing this indefinitely? Meeting twice a week and having intense conversations and pretending there's no tension between us?" "There's always going to be tension between us," Evan said. "The question is whether we're ready to do something about it." "I'm ready," Clara said, and she meant it. Or thought she did. "Are you?" Evan stepped closer. Close enough that Clara could feel the warmth of him, could see the way his jaw tightened. "Because from where I'm standing, you're still playing it safe. You're still editing yourself. Not as much as before, but enough that I can see it." "What do you want me to do?" Clara's voice rose. "You want me to be some perfect version of myself who knows exactly what she wants and isn't afraid to ask for it?" "I'm trying, Evan. I'm here. I'm asking. What more do you want?" "I want you to stop performing," Evan said quietly. "I want you to stop trying to be the woman you think I want and just be the woman you are." "I don't know who that is anymore." The words came out louder than she intended, echoing across the waterfront. Clara felt exposed, raw. She'd admitted the thing she'd been trying so hard to hide. Evan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I know. That's it. You know." "Yeah. I've known since the coffee shop. You're rebuilding yourself, Clara. Trying to figure out who you are when you're not making yourself small for someone else. And that's good work. Important work. But you can't do it while trying to figure us out at the same time. Clara felt something crack inside her. So that's it. We just stop. No, Evan said. We slow down. We give you space to figure out who you are without me in the equation. And then when you know, really know, you decide if what you want includes me. That could take months, Clara said. Years. Maybe. But rushing it doesn't help either of us. Clara wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. But the truth was, he wasn't wrong. She was still figuring it out. Still testing boundaries, still learning to take up space, still navigating the gap between who she'd been with Julian and who she wanted to become. I don't want to lose you, Clara said quietly. You won't, Evan said. But I won't let you use me to avoid the hard work of rebuilding yourself either. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, she saw what he'd been trying to show her all along. He wasn't offering her salvation. He wasn't offering to fix her or complete her or make her whole. He was offering her a mirror. Steady, unflinching, showing her exactly who she was without softening the edges. And what she saw was someone who was stronger than she'd given herself credit for. Someone who'd survived a relationship that should have broken her. Someone who was learning, slowly, to stop apologizing for existing. Okay, Clara said finally. Okay. You're right. I'm not ready. Not for this. Not yet. The admission hurt, but it also felt true in a way few things had felt true lately. Evan nodded. So what do you need? Time, Clara said. And space. And maybe we don't meet for a while. Because I think as long as you're here, I'll keep trying to figure out who I am in relation to you instead of just figuring out who I am. That's probably smart, Evan said, and there was something like pride in his voice. They stood there on the waterfront, the city humming around them, and Clara felt something settle. It wasn't closure, exactly. But it was clarity. Will you still be here? She asked. When I figure it out? That depends, Evan said. On what? On whether you figure out you want me, or you figure out you just wanted to be wanted. Clara took a breath. And if it's the second thing? Then I'll be happy you figured it out. And I'll be glad I didn't let you use me to avoid it. Clara nodded. It hurt. This honesty, this refusal to be anything less than real with each other. But it also felt right. Clean. Like cutting away dead tissue to let healthy skin grow. Thank you, Clara said. For what? For not letting me disappear. Even when it would have been easier. Evan smiled. Small, sad, but genuine. That was the deal, remember? Clara laughed, a sound caught somewhere between grief and relief. Yeah, it was. They walked back toward the subway in silence, and when they reached the station where their paths diverged, Evan paused. One more thing, he said. What? When you figure it out, who you are, what you want, don't tell me right away. Sit with it first. Make sure it's solid. Make sure it's yours and not something you think I want to hear. Clara nodded. Okay. And Clara. Evan's expression was serious. Don't make yourself small again. Not for me, not for anyone. Whatever you build, make sure there's room in it for all of you. I will, Clara said, and she meant it. They parted ways at the subway entrance, and Clara watched Evan disappear down the stairs before turning toward her own train. As she rode home, she thought about what he'd said. About not being his proof of concept. About needing to separate being seen from being wanted. He was right. She knew he was right. She'd been confusing the two things, using his attention as validation that she was worth wanting. But that wasn't fair to either of them. Clara needed to want herself first. Needed to rebuild her life not around the absence of Julian or the potential of Evan, but around herself. Her needs, her desires, her voice. It was terrifying work. The kind that required her to sit with herself, really sit with herself, without the distraction of another person to orient around. But as the train carried her through the dark tunnels beneath the city, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt ready. Not ready for Evan. Not ready for love. But ready to do the work. Ready to stop performing and start existing. Ready to take up space without apology. And maybe, eventually, that would be enough to build something real. Something that didn't require her to disappear to maintain. But first, she had to find out who she was when no one was watching. And that was work only she could do. Chapter 8: Love Without Disappearing. 4 months without Evan felt like both an eternity and an instant. Clara threw herself into the work of becoming. Not becoming someone new, but uncovering who she'd been before she learned to make herself small. It was archaeological work, carefully brushing away layers of performance and people-pleasing to find the solid ground beneath. She started therapy. Not with Evan. That would have defeated the purpose. But with a woman named Dr. Chan who had silver hair and a directness that reminded Clara of her grandmother. Dr. Chen didn't let her get away with anything. When Clara tried to intellectualize her feelings, Dr. Chen would stop her. What do you feel? Not what do you think. What do you feel? It was harder than Clara expected. She'd spent so long analyzing her emotions rather than experiencing them that actually feeling them felt foreign. Raw. Like learning to use a limb that had fallen asleep. She also started saying no. Small things at first. No, she couldn't cover for a colleague who was chronically late with manuscripts. No, she didn't want to go to dinner with friends who only ever talked about their relationships. No, she wasn't available this weekend because she needed time alone. Each no felt like ripping off a bandage. Painful but also necessary. Revealing healthy skin underneath. And she started saying yes to things she actually wanted. Yes to the writing workshop she'd been putting off for years. Yes to the solo trip to Montreal she'd always dreamed of taking. Yes to mornings spent in bed reading just because she wanted to, not because she'd earned the rest. Slowly, incrementally, Clara began to recognize herself again. Not the woman she'd been with Julian. Not the woman she'd been trying to become for Evan. But someone else. Someone who existed for her own sake. 3.5 months after she and Evan parted ways, Clara woke up one morning and realized something had shifted. She didn't immediately think about him when she opened her eyes. Didn't wonder what he was doing, whether he'd moved on, whether he still thought about her. She thought about coffee. About the manuscript she was editing. About whether she wanted to go for a run or take the day slowly. It was such a small thing. Such an ordinary realization. But it felt monumental. Clara was existing in her own life again. Not in relation to someone else. Not as a reaction to loss. Just existing. That afternoon, she texted him. Just one message. I think I'm ready to talk. Evan's response came 3 hours later. Coffee shop. Saturday. Noon. Clara smiled. Same place they'd met. Same time they'd had their first real conversation. It felt right. Circular in a way that didn't feel suffocating but complete. When Saturday came, Clara felt nervous but steady. She dressed carefully, not to impress, but because she wanted to feel like herself. Jeans and a soft sweater that made her feel comfortable in her own skin. Evan was already there when she arrived, sitting at their table by the window. He looked the same. Dark hair, grey-blue eyes, that steady attention that had both terrified and thrilled her. But there was something different too. He looked lighter. Less like he was carrying something heavy. "Hi," Clara said, sitting down. "Hi." Evan smiled, and it reached his eyes. "You look good." "Thanks." "So do you." They sat in silence for a moment. Not awkward, but waited. Like they were both taking stock of who the other had become in these 4 months apart. "So," Evan said finally, "did you figure it out?" "Figure what out?" "Who you are. What you want." Clara took a breath. "Yeah, I think I did." And I want you, Clara said. The words came out steady, clear. No hedging, no softening. Just truth. Not because I need to be wanted. Not because you see me and that feels like validation. But because I like who I am when I'm with you. Because you make me want to be bigger instead of smaller. Because when I think about my life moving forward, I want you in it. Evan's expression didn't change, but Clara saw something shift in his eyes. That's a good answer. It's the truth. I know. Evan leaned forward. But there's something you need to know before we do this. What? I'm not going to make it easy, Evan said. I'm not going to let you disappear when things get hard. I'm not going to soften my edges to make you comfortable. And I'm going to call you out when you start making yourself small again. I know, Clara said. And you're okay with that? I'm okay with it because I know I need it. Because I trust you to see me even when I'm trying to hide. Clara paused. But I need something from you too. What? I need you to let me see you. Really see you. Not just the therapist. Not just the guy who has all the answers. I need to see the messy parts. The parts that aren't sure. The parts that might need me too. Evan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. That's fair. And harder than you might think. I know, Clara said. But that's the deal. We both show up. No hiding. No performing. Just us. Whoever that is. Evan reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her like this. Deliberately, intimately. His hand was warm, solid, real. Okay, he said. Let's find out who we are together. Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not the desperate relief of being chosen. Not the anxious need for validation. But something quieter. Something that felt like coming home. They talked for 2 hours. About what they'd done in the time apart. About the work Clara had been doing with Dr. Chen. About a case Evan had been working on that had challenged him in ways he hadn't expected. And through it all, Clara felt herself being fully present. Not editing her words. Not moderating her enthusiasm or her opinions. Just existing, in full color, without apology. When they finally left the coffee shop, Evan walked her home. At her door, he paused. I want to kiss you, he said. But I'm going to wait. Why? Because I want to make sure we're both sure. That this isn't just momentum. That we're choosing this consciously. Clara felt a spike of frustration, but also, underneath it, respect. He was right. They needed to be deliberate about this. Needed to build it on solid ground instead of the shaky foundation of need. How long? She asked. Until it feels inevitable, Evan said. Until we're both so sure that waiting feels ridiculous. Clara laughed. That's very you. Yeah, Evan agreed. It is. He left, and Clara went inside, closing the door behind her. She leaned against it, feeling the ghost of his hand still warm in hers. It wasn't the romantic ending she might have scripted. No passionate kiss. No dramatic declaration. But it felt right. Solid. Like they were building something that could hold weight. Over the next month, they saw each other regularly. Dinners. Walks. Long conversations that stretched into the night. And with each interaction, Clara felt more certain. Not because Evan was perfect. He wasn't. He could be frustratingly direct, maddeningly unwilling to soften hard truths. But because she liked who she was with him. Liked the way he pushed her to be honest, to take up space, to stop apologizing for her existence. And slowly, she began to see his rough edges too. The way he withdrew when he was processing something difficult. The way he struggled to ask for help, preferring to handle everything himself. The way he could be so good at seeing others but terrible at letting others see him. She called him on it, gently but firmly. And to his credit, he listened. Started opening up about the parts of himself he usually kept hidden. started letting her see his uncertainty, his fear, his need. They were building something. Not a fairy tale. Not a romance novel meet-cute that would resolve by page 300. But something real. Something that could hold both of them, in all their messy, complicated, still healing glory. And then, on a cold November evening as they walked through the park, Evan stopped. "What?" Clara asked. "It feels inevitable now," he said. "What does?" "This." And he kissed her. It wasn't soft or gentle. It was intense, consuming. Like every conversation they'd ever had compressed into a single moment. Like 4 months of restraint finally released. When they broke apart, Clara was breathless. "Took you long enough," she managed. Evan laughed. "Worth the wait." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. This man who'd seen her at her lowest and hadn't looked away. Who'd pushed her to rebuild herself before letting her lean on him. Who'd refused to let her disappear even when that would have been easier. "Yeah," she said. "Worth the wait." They walked home hand in hand, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara felt complete. Not because someone had filled the empty spaces inside her, but because she'd learned to fill them herself. And now, she was choosing to share that fullness with someone else. Not out of need. Not out of fear of being alone. But because she wanted to. And that made all the difference. Epilogue: she stayed whole. 1 year later, Clara stood in her apartment. A different apartment now, one she'd chosen for herself rather than accepting because it was convenient, and looked at the woman in the mirror. She was getting ready for a dinner party. Her dinner party. Something she'd never done before, too worried about being a burden, about asking people to make time for her. But tonight, her living room would be full of people she'd invited without apologizing. Mira. Dr. Chen, who'd become more friend than therapist after their sessions ended. A few colleagues from work. And Evan, of course. The dynamic between them had evolved into something Clara couldn't have predicted. They fought more than she and Julian ever had. Real fights, with raised voices and hurt feelings and the messy work of repair afterward. But they also laughed more. Touched more. Existed more fully in each other's presence. It wasn't always easy. Some days, Clara still caught herself trying to make herself smaller when conflicts arose. Some days, Evan still withdrew when he should have leaned in. But they called each other on it. They pushed back. They refused to let each other disappear. And it was working. Slowly, imperfectly, but working. Clara heard the door open. Evan, arriving early to help set up. She walked out of the bedroom to find him unpacking wine glasses from a box. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said. "I wanted to." He looked up and smiled. "You look beautiful." "Thank you." Clara accepted the compliment without deflecting, without minimizing. It had taken practice, but she'd learned. They worked in comfortable silence, setting out plates and arranging food. When everything was ready, Evan pulled Clara into a hug. "I'm proud of you," he said. "For throwing a party. For everything. For doing the work. For showing up. For not disappearing." Clara pulled back to look at him. "I couldn't have done it without you." "That's not true," Evan said gently. "You did it. I just held up the mirror." The doorbell rang. Mira, characteristically early, with a bottle of wine and a wide smile. Then the others arrived in quick succession, filling Clara's apartment with noise and warmth and life. During dinner, someone asked Clara about the book she was editing. A contemporary romance about a woman rebuilding her life after divorce. Clara launched into an animated description of what was working and what wasn't, her hands gesturing as she talked about character arc and emotional truth. Halfway through, she caught Evan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When there was a lull in conversation later, she leaned over and whispered, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Just watching you take up space." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. Because he was right. She was taking up space. Not apologizing for her enthusiasm. Not tempering her opinions. just existing loudly and unapologetically. After dinner, as people lingered over wine and conversation, Clara stepped out onto her small balcony for air. The city spread out below her, lights twinkling in the darkness. She thought about Julian. Not with anger anymore, or even much sadness. Just with a quiet acknowledgement of what that relationship had taught her. About the cost of making herself small. About the difference between being loved and being chosen. About the importance of showing up for herself. She didn't regret it. Any of it. Not the 3 years with Julian, not the months of heartbreak afterward, not even the painful work of rebuilding. Because all of it had led her here. To this moment, this life, this version of herself that could host dinner parties and argue passionately about books and be in a relationship without disappearing. The door opened behind her. Evan, carrying 2 glasses of wine. "You okay?" he asked, handing her one. "Yeah. Just thinking. About how different everything is now. How different I am." Evan leaned against the railing beside her. "You're not that different. You're just more yourself." Clara considered that. Maybe. But it feels different from the inside. "That's because you're not editing anymore. You're just being." They stood in silence, watching the city. Then Clara said, "I saw him the other day." "Julian?" "Yeah. At a bookstore. He was with someone. A woman. She looked nice. Happy." "How did that feel?" Evan asked. "Okay, actually. Like seeing someone I used to know but don't anymore." There was no pain. No anger. Just neutrality. "That's growth." "I think so." Clara took a sip of wine. "I hope he's happy. Really. I hope he found someone who wants what he has to give. Who doesn't need more than he can offer." "That's generous." "Maybe. But I also just don't care as much as I used to. He's part of my past, but he's not the most important part anymore." Evan turned to look at her. "What is the most important part?" Clara thought about it. "The part where I learned I could lose someone and not lose myself. The part where I figured out how to be whole on my own. The part where I stopped waiting for someone to choose me and chose myself instead." "And now?" Evan asked quietly. "Now I'm choosing you too. Not instead of myself. In addition to myself." Evan set down his wine glass and pulled her close. "That's all I've ever wanted." They stood there on the balcony, wrapped in each other and the sounds of their friends inside, and Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Complete. Not because someone else had completed her, but because she'd completed herself. And now she was sharing that completeness with someone who saw all of her. The messy parts, the healing parts, the strong parts, the uncertain parts, and chose her anyway. Inside, someone laughed. Myra's voice, probably telling a story that would have everyone in stitches. Clara's life, full of people she'd let in without apologizing for the space they took up. "We should go back in," Clara said. "In a minute," Evan said. "I want to stay here with you a little longer." Clara smiled and leaned into him. They'd have a lifetime of minutes. Of choices made consciously, of showing up fully, of refusing to let each other, or themselves, disappear. The city hummed below them. Inside, her friends were laughing. And Clara stood on her balcony, in her own apartment, with a man who saw her and wanted her, and felt more at home in her own skin than she ever had before. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There would be hard days ahead. Conflicts to navigate. Old patterns to resist. But it was real. Solid. Built on a foundation of self-awareness and honest communication and mutual commitment to showing up. And for Clara, that was more valuable than any fairy tale. She'd learned the hard way that love couldn't save her. That being chosen by someone else didn't matter if she couldn't choose herself. But now she had both. She'd chosen herself. And in doing so, she'd become someone worthy of being chosen by someone else. Not because she was perfect. Not because she'd erased all her damage or healed all her wounds. But because she'd learned to exist without disappearing. To love without losing herself. To be seen without hiding. And that, Clara had learned, was the only kind of love worth having. The kind that let you stay whole. The door opened again. Mira, calling them back inside for dessert. Clara took Evan's hand and let him pull her toward the warmth and noise of her living room. Her life. Her people. Her space. All of it, finally, truly hers. And she wouldn't disappear again. Not for anyone. Not even for love. Because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. That the right kind of love didn't ask you to disappear. It demanded you stay visible. And Clara, whole, healing, present, was finally ready for that.